Hello everybody, welcome back to another exciting edition of Ed Puzzle Lecture Notes. Same as a lecture in college, just on your computer. Alright, so we're entering a new unit, the last unit, I think, of the first semester. Today we're going to be going over cell membranes, and later we're going to go over cell transport. But today, so remember, all living things are made of cells. So if that was a cell, and that's like the nucleus inside the cell membrane is the outer covering, which separates everything outside the cell from things inside the cell. So basically the cell membrane is kind of like the skin of the cell. Or if you want to think of it like Tulare Western High School, it's kind of like the fence that goes around the entire school. The fence keeps people that aren't students at Western out, and it keeps Tulare Western students in from trying to leave campus. So that is what the cell membrane is. It is the outer covering of the cell. And the daily objective for today. So basically, by the time class ends, you should be able to describe what the cell membranes are made of and what their function or their job is. Why are cell membranes important for cells and important for living things? So you should be able to do that by the time you leave class today. Alright, so an introduction to the cell membrane. I usually call it the cell membrane, but sometimes it'll be called the plasma membrane. I don't say that, so don't worry about that. Sometimes I will call it the lipid bilayer. Lipid bilayer, it's called that because it's made of lipids. Remember, lipids are like fat. And there's two layers. So it's kind of like a sandwich. There's two layers. Bi means two. So it's a double layer of lipids. That's why it's sometimes called the lipid bilayer, but usually I'll just call it the cell membrane. Alright, so part of our daily objective was just answered. What are cell membranes mostly made out of? Hopefully you just said they're mostly made out of lipids, which are like fats. Mostly made out of lipids. Here's the other part. What is the job or function that cell membranes do for cells and for living things? And here's what it does. It regulates what enters and leaves the cell. So if this is the cell membrane, it allows certain things to move in and out, but it blocks others. So just like the fence around Tulare Western, air and bugs can freely go in and out of the fence around Tulare Western, but students cannot. The little holes in the fence are too small for students to sneak out of school, and they're also too small for people wandering around campus to come onto campus. So that is the job of the cell membrane. It regulates what enters and exits the cell. So it controls what can come in and out of the cell. And this thing I already said, it's a bilayer. Just like up here, it's a bilayer. It's got two layers of lipids, kind of like a sandwich. And this I'm not going to ask you about, so don't worry about that. And so we heard that the cell membrane is made mostly of lipids. Lipids, that was one of the four macromolecules we learned about: carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So it's made mostly of lipids, but there are proteins that are embedded or kind of like stuck in the cell membrane. What are their functions? What are the functions of the proteins that are stuck in the cell membrane? If you can't remember all four, forget about one, forget about two. You can put those if you want. Like some are receptors, which allows cells to communicate with one another. Some are attachment points, so cells can be kind of stuck together or stuck to other things that are outside the cell. But 3 and 4 is what I'm going to ask you about. One important role that proteins play in the cell membrane is they're kind of like an ID card. They're recognition proteins. They're kind of like an ID card. In case you didn't know, you have an immune system. So if cells come into your body like bacteria and you get sick, your immune system notices that those cells do not belong inside your body, and your immune system will attack them. They will attack them, they'll actually eat them. But since your cells have an ID card, they have proteins which tell your immune system, hey, I belong inside of you. Your immune system will not attack them. So they serve as kind of like your ID cards that you use at school. And so this could be like one right here. That could be a protein that's like an ID card, so your immune system will not attack that cell. And the other one we've gone over before briefly. Some proteins act as channels, or they're also called carrier proteins. So they're kind of like a door, like glucose. Glucose is a pretty large sugar molecule. It cannot get through the cell membrane. It needs a door in order to get in. So things like glucose, which are large. Glucose is also polar, just like water. Remember, water is polar. And ions, which have a positive or negative charge, all of those things require some sort of door or channel to let them in, because they cannot get through the cell membrane. They need a door, and that is another thing that proteins do for cells. And now like a close-up diagram of what a cell membrane looks like. So remember, if this is a cell, and that's the nucleus inside the cell, the outer covering around the cell, that's the cell membrane, and this is like a close-up view of that. So remember, it's made out of lipids, and they say it's a bilayer because, look, there's 1, 2 layers of lipids, and they kind of look like balloons and strings. It is these strings in here, the string part, those are the lipids. Now, if you notice, these little things, these little balloons and strings, they're really close together. And I hope you remember from our water lab, where when you put a drop of water on wax paper, remember, the water would not stick to the wax paper because water is polar, and wax, which is a lipid, is nonpolar. So these lipid tails, these little strings, they block things from going in and out. Things like water, glucose, they cannot get through there because the lipids block them. Plus, they're really close together, so large molecules like glucose can't get through them. So those things need a door. They need a protein channel in order to go in and to go out. So that's a protein channel right there that acts like a door that allows things to come in and out of the cell. Now, other things like oxygen, O2, which we breathe, and carbon dioxide, CO2, those gases, they can freely go in and out directly through the balloons and strings, directly through what these are called phospholipids. The balloon and string is called a phospholipid. So things like gases like oxygen and CO2, they don't need a door. They don't need a door. They can go straight through the balloons and strings. They can go straight through the phospholipid bilayer. And here's a close-up look at the balloon and strings. There's the balloon and strings right there, which make up the cell membrane. They're called phospholipids. And they're called that because the little balloon part, that is a phosphate. Phosphate. You don't really need to know what that is, but it's a phosphate, and know that it's hydrophilic. Hydrophilic, which means it likes water. It's attracted to water because it is polar. Hopefully you remember in our water lab, drops of water do stick to regular paper because they're both polar. Water also sticks to glass because they're both polar. So the balloon part of the phospholipid is polar and it's hydrophilic. It likes water. Now, just like the wax paper in our water lab, the lipid tails, these little strings part of the phospholipid, they're hydrophobic. They hate water because they're nonpolar. Remember, nonpolar does not like to be with polar. So the lipid tails are hydrophobic, whereas the balloon part are hydrophilic. They like water. The tails do not like water. And why do things need to move across the cell membrane? Why is movement across the cell membrane even necessary? Why do you need any movement? Well, your cells need stuff. They need nutrients. They need food. They need glucose. They also need oxygen. All those things need to be able to go into the cell. Also, your cell needs to get rid of things that it does not need. It needs to get rid of waste products, especially carbon dioxide. Because when you breathe out CO2 or carbon dioxide. Well, how's it going to get out of the cell? Well, that's what movement across the cell membrane is important, because the cell needs to get rid of that carbon dioxide. It needs to get rid of the wastes, and it needs to bring in the good stuff that it needs. And two terms you should definitely know. So, little tiny review. Remember, a cell, this is the cell membrane. There's the nucleus within the cell. Cell membrane is what goes all the way around the cell. So the cell membrane allows certain things to go in and out freely, but other things get blocked. It will not let them in. And that's called being semi-permeable or selectively permeable. If you've ever made spaghetti, or you watch your mom or dad or whoever make spaghetti, you know before you put the spaghetti on the plate, you got to put it in a strainer. So you put the water and the spaghetti in the strainer. Well, the water goes right through the little holes in the strainer, but your spaghetti gets blocked. The spaghetti gets stuck in the strainer. That's being selectively permeable, because it allows certain things like water to go through it, but it blocks the spaghetti. It does not let the spaghetti go through. And that's all selectively or semi-permeable means. So what are some things that can move in and out freely? I guess we'll say water, but it's really not true. Water can't get through because water is polar, and the little lipid tails, those little strings, they block the water, but we'll pretend like that's true. Oxygen can go in and out of the cell freely. Carbon dioxide gas can go in and out freely. And fats can also go straight through the cell membrane freely. What are things that cannot go through? Large polar molecules like glucose cannot get through. And also ions, if they're charged, they cannot get through. The cell membrane blocks those things. Those things need a door, like this door right here. And remember, that would be a protein channel that allows large molecules to enter or exit the cell. All right, I don't know why I left this slide in here. It's kind of worthless. But anyways, remember the cell membrane goes around the entire cell. So it's kind of like this. Here are the phospholipid bilayer. There's one layer, there's two layers. But it's not like a circle. It's kind of like a bubble. So it goes around the entire cell in 3 dimensions. So you can kind of think of it like a balloon that's been blown up with air. The balloon part, the rubber part, that's like the cell membrane, and the air inside the balloon is kind of like the cytoplasm inside the cell. And now a quick little review, see if you can get some of these answers correct. All right, the cell membrane is made up of what looks like balloons and strings, and here's a little diagram of it. That balloon and strings would be called a what? Okay, hopefully you said that balloon and strings looks like a phospholipid. That is a phospholipid. Balloons and strings are the phospholipids which make up your cell membrane. Now, we said that the balloon part, which is made of phosphate, it is attracted to water. What term means it is attracted to water? All right, hopefully you said that the term that means attracted to water is hydro, which means water, philic. That means it likes water because it's polar. Now, if we remember, the lipid tails do not like water. They repel water. What term means that it repels water or does not like water? Let's see if you can get it. Hopefully you said that the term that means that it repels water, that it does not like water, is called hydrophobic. Hydrophobic. Hydro means water. Phobic kind of means like you're afraid of water. So the lipid tails are hydrophobic, where the balloon part, the phosphate, is hydrophilic. It likes water. All right, thank you very much for listening. I hope you understood most of that, and I'll talk to you next time.